Here we go. So I'm Father Carl, as you all know. I'm delighted to be joined by Marguerite Lebrun and Christina Schoenfeld, who will be making the bulk of this presentation today. I think I'm going to switch to folks who are on Zoom. Please speak up if you have questions, and do that by putting your by typing into the chat, please. And I'll try to repeat everything that's said in the room so that can be heard, and then I'll repeat out things that you're sharing. So good morning, Susan. Thank you. Excellent use of the chat. I'm going to share my screen. And minimize this. Okay. Would it be all right if we began with a little bit of silence and a word of prayer? I've just been running around in the churchyard, literally running around in the churchyard with the confirmation group. I also need to catch my breath. Holy God, we trust that you are leading us into the paths of life. We want to answer. We trust that you are drawing us into a deeper and richer story. And we want to answer. We trust that even though it may be hard to let go of some of the stories, some of the identities that we have held dear, we know that you are with us. And we trust that your promise includes us all, includes all parts of us, all that we bring, all our gifts, all our wounds, all our histories. We trust that you will guide all this to your redeeming purposes. Thank you for this time and this fellowship and this work that you have given us to do. Amen. So last week I gave a fuller introduction about some of the about our approach to these historical questions and framing this work that we're going to be doing together over the next year. And I'm not going to give that whole presentation today, but I'm just going to touch on a few highlights, as it were. One passage that has really been speaking to me in the midst of this is from the prophet Jeremiah. Sebastian, would you mind reading this passage out for us, please?
Stand at the cross and look as for
The ancient
path the way is and walking. And you find rest in your soul.
Thank you, Sebastian. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. So we are one of many churches in the Diocese of Long Island that is standing at a kind of crossroads, asking, what does it mean to be church at this stage of the pandemic in the 21st century? As the neighborhoods around us change, as we welcome some of the movements for justice that have gained more public prominence in the past few years. What are the choices being offered to us, and how do we walk in the good way? Where can we find rest for our souls? So part of what asking for the ancient paths mean is asking, how did we get here as this parish, as this gathering of the body of Christ in this place? And again, we are doing this with many other parishes in the diocese. This man, Craig Townsend, is the historian in residence for racial justice for the whole diocese. And he is working with parishes to ask some of the questions that we're asking about the presence and absence of Black Americans in Zion's history. That's the focus of our presentation today, but so much else. And if any of you are really interested in these historical questions, he's giving a webinar on Tuesday evening, which will also be recorded if you want to watch later, about some of the work that's happening around the diocese. And I just think it's pretty exciting to be a part of this. But the big questions for us are about integrating what we understand about our past into our present and our future, into our mission. So one question we're asking is, we have so much to be proud of. How might the gifts of our legacy shape and sustain our call to be Christ's hands and heart in this world, today and tomorrow? But also, and this was sort of part of what I was driving at in my sermon today, what are some of the things that maybe we haven't been paying attention to, that haven't fit within the story we've been telling ourselves about Zion, about the church, about the forces that have split, divided, harmed our communities? If we pay more attention to that, how might those wounds be calling us to seek healing and reconciliation? I want to be very clear. We're in a time right now where questions about history, returning to our national history, revising, reinterpreting things, these are very politically fraught and polarized questions. And I want to be quite clear that in this project, we are going to be pursuing these questions in light of the gospel, which tells us that the truth will set us free, that we do not need to be afraid. We can tell hard truths, even hard truths about ourselves, trusting that there's nothing we can learn that will change God's love for us, that the story of God's redeeming love is big enough to contain anything that might disturb or upset us. So I'm really excited to welcome Marguerite and Christina to share just again some of the preliminary things we've been learning. The big focus of this presentation today is to share that and to invite all of you in to this process over the next year. Maybe you really get excited about working on Ancestry.com and other historical researches. You like genealogy, you like looking at old news articles or burrowing through archives. Fantastic. We'd love for you to bring those skills and passions to this project. Maybe that does not excite you at all, but you are drawn into these questions of things that get stirred up. What does it mean for us today to know this about who we have been in the past, know these new things about our history? And we'll be having a number of conversations throughout the next year that I hope you will contribute to candidly, honestly. I'm really struggling with this. I'm angry about this. I don't know how to feel about this. That is fully invited, and I look forward to those conversations, which will be beginning today after this short presentation. So please feel welcome to share what's coming up for you. Marguerite.
Thank you, Father Carl, and thank you for sharing the good news, those words of reconciliation and hope. And thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to see all of you here today. After more than a year of research into Zion's history, it finally became time to share everything that had been discovered up to this point. At first, I felt confused, not knowing where to begin. There was so much to tell. The story was so big. Finally, I heard a voice in my head. It was the voice of Detective Joe Friday from Dragnet saying, "All we want are the facts, ma'am, just the facts." And so that's why what I'm here to do, just give you the facts. The person you see in the portrait here, that was Wynant Van Zandt Jr. At the time of his birth in 1767, New York was still a British colony. We know that he was a prominent merchant, engaged in global trade, exporting sugar and rum from the Caribbean. Records show that he was an alderman of New York City, which was kind of like a city council member and was an elected position. From this, we can infer that he was a well-respected member of the community. In addition, he was elected a vestryman of Trinity Church in Manhattan from 1806 to 1811. His true love of the church was expressed by his gift of the land and the grounds on which Zion Church stands. The founding of Zion in 1830 was made possible by his gift. His remains and those of some of his family members are interred beneath this building. This plaque, which we have all passed many times, is dedicated to the memory of our generous founder. On July 21st, 1788, Wynant married Maria Allaire Underhill, daughter of Israel Underhill of the Underhill family of Westchester County. Upon Maria's marriage to Wynant, her father, Israel Underhill, presented her with 4 enslaved African people: Charles Pine, Caesar, Elsie, and Margaret Pine. At that time, slavery was widespread in New York State and throughout New England, as the Port of New York was a hub for the slave trade all along the East Coast. Although the slave market on Wall Street had been closed in the 1760s before Wynant was born, it is possible that while Wynant Van Zandt was still living in Manhattan, his daily route to his office on Wall Street may have passed the site where the former slave market had once stood in Lower Manhattan. In 1813, Wynant, Maria, and their family moved from New York City to a 120-acre farm in Little Neck, Long Island, or as it is now called, Douglaston. At this time, Margaret Pine, one of the Van Zandt's enslaved African people, expressed a desire to remain in Manhattan as she did not wish to live in the country. Therefore, in 1813, when he and his family moved to Long Island, Wynant Van Zandt granted manumission, which is freedom from slavery, to Margaret Pine. Please note that 3 years later, in 1816, Wynant also manumitted Charles Pine and Elsie. I'm going to hand the podium over to Christina now, going to give us the context of the times.
Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you, Father Carl. One of the things that came through our research is that Wynant was a man of his time. As we saw, he did own slaves. And this comes as a surprise to some, as slavery was seen as a Southern thing. But there was a slave market on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, as Marguerite just spoke of. And in the mid-18th century, when Wyatt was born. Approximately 1 in 5 people living in New York City was enslaved, and almost half of Manhattan households included at least one slave. And this we know from a plaque commemorating the New York City slave market. I wonder what it does to a person's soul, to grow up in that kind of environment. As we said, Wyatt was a member of the vestry of Trinity Church, and Trinity has its own history of racism and segregation. From the church's beginnings in 1696 to the abolition of slavery in New York State in 1827, records show that the parish enlisted slave labor in the building of its first church. Specifically, 12 members of the group were cited as managers, charged with the building and development of the church. The members were each designated to provide a Negro to work on the building, in addition to subscription fees being charged for membership in the church. And if someone did not have a Negro, they were expected to find one, to borrow, or to rent one. Churches themselves at that time were segregated. In the early 1700s, many non-Africans believed that Africans had no souls and perished as beasts. Many religious establishments saw no need to educate Africans. Some did, however, including Trinity Wall Street. In 1704, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was formed to preach to the outcasts, and the School for Negroes was opened. But Trinity Wall Street did not allow Black people to worship in the sanctuary. They were forced to gather for Bible study and worship in the basement of the church. Eventually, under the leadership of Peter Williams Jr., an abolitionist and the first Black deacon in the Diocese of New York, these Black Episcopalians got tired of being treated as second-class citizens. They founded St. Peter's Church in Harlem. The Free African Church of St. Philip was formed by those who refused to continue to accept the racism they faced in worship, but who wished to worship in the Anglican way. For some Black Episcopalians, the racism of the Episcopal Church was too much. They started their own denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME. The AME Church was co-founded in 1794 by former Delaware slave Richard Allen and gradually expanded worldwide. The largest AME church building in Queens is located on Union Street in the heart of Flushing. Salem AME is not just the oldest African-American church in the Roslyn area, but it is also the oldest church in the community. Its founders were descendants of enslaved African-Americans and Native Americans. There was also an AME church here in Douglaston, just 2 blocks north of the line. The former St. Peter's African Methodist Episcopal Church was located in a small 1-story building at the stub end of Orient Avenue, north of 42nd Avenue. It was a house of worship for many of the 20th century, but it is now a private dwelling. The presence of St. Peter's AME right here in Douglaston raises big questions for us. Was St. Peter's founded because Black Christians did not feel welcome at Zion in the 19th and early 20th centuries? We'd also like to know if or how the Zion community responded to abolitionists, to the Civil War, and later to the Civil Rights Movement. Looking at these segregated churches, another question comes to mind is how the sacraments were viewed in a segregated world. Were the sacraments given at the Black churches seen as valid by the broader Episcopal Church? We contend that while there may be segregation among churches, there is no segregation at the table for the Eucharist. While people may be buried separately, there is no segregation in the afterworld. Segregation is a man-made construct and has no place in the eyes of the Lord. Marguerite.
Margaret Kine. During the course of this preliminary research, we have discovered that it is very difficult to learn about enslaved people and the details of their lives. Few records exist. For example, we know nothing of what happened to Charles Kine and Elsie following their manumission in 1816. We do not know what happened to Caesar. Was he ever freed? Did he die while enslaved? Some information does exist concerning Margaret Pine, however. We do know that Margaret Pine was born in 1778, that she was with the Van Zandt family from a young age, and that she was enslaved by them for 35 years. We know that she died in 1857 at the age of 79 and is buried in the Van Zandt family burial ground in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. But everything else we know about Margaret Pine is filtered through the point of view of white men. This article, originally printed in the Brooklyn Star, claims that Margaret Pine was the last slave in New York State. What exactly does that mean? Let's take a look at what the article tells us. It is entitled Death of the Last Slave in the State of New York. Margaret Pine, a slave belonging to the family of Wine and Van Zandt, deceased, formerly of Little Neck, departed this life on the 4th of September, age 79 years. She was born in Westchester County in 1778. She was presented to Mr. Van Zandt by his father in her comparative infancy. She remained in the family until the year 1813, at which period, she not being willing to remain in the country, Mr. Van Zandt gave her a release to the following effect. The words are here. The bearer, Margaret Pine, is my servant. She has lived with me from her infancy. She is sober, honest, and faithful, but is averse to living in the country. She has my permission to go to New York for the purpose of going out to service and to receive her wages until this permission is revoked by me, of which due notice will be given to any person or persons in whose employ she may be. I further declare that it is my wish, and I am now willing to manumit her according to law, given under my hand at Little Neck Farm, this 16th day of September, 1813, signed Wynant Van Zandt. Note that it is not clear whether or not Wynant actually did manumit Margaret. Notice too, how much of this article is really about Wynant Van Zandt, what he did and said. That's because the article was likely based on the account of Dr. Charles A. Van Zandt, one of Wynant's sons. The article is based on his perspective. Fair warning, some of his language may feel cringy to us from our vantage point some 164 years later. To all whom it may concern, Dr. Charles A. Van Zandt of our city superintended the whole arrangements of the funeral and buried her in his family burial ground at Greenwood. As the doctor says, she had a black skin, but a pure soul. When she was asked if she would have a physician, she replied no, that Jesus was her physician. She was also asked if she had any particular place that she wished her body to be placed. She replied no, it was of but little consequence about the body if the soul was safe. And she was tired of traveling. And if it was the will of her heavenly master to take her home, she was ready and willing to go. She lived like a sincere Christian and died like one, cheerful and without a struggle to the last. Brooklyn Star. As Charles saw her, Margaret's spiritual purity was a counterbalance to her racial inferiority. She had a black skin, but a pure soul. Cringe. The story he tells about the end of her life also portrays her as unconcerned with the condition of her body. But do we really believe that if Margaret Pine spoke to us herself, That she wouldn't care if she were enslaved or free? Charles describes Margaret's Christian faith as sincere because she was cheerful and did not struggle. That fits nicely with the racist idea that Black people were happy under slavery. But another part of the article hints that Margaret was willing to stand up for herself, to demand what she deserved. She had acted in the capacity of nurse to the whole family of sons, there having been born 11 of them, and 6 of whom are now living, the eldest being 69 years of age. This is quoted from the article. It is a singular fact that he had her services for the best part of her life, and that she wished him to take care of her as long as she lived, and he willingly consented. In New York, in the early 1800s, enslaved people yearned for freedom, but those who were freed faced a difficult road. There were very few economic opportunities for free Black people, and they were starting life from scratch. After all the labor that had been stolen from them, they had no property, no assets, no money, no home. Did Margaret demand that Wynand Van Zandt provide some kind of safety net for her, even as she left his service to begin her own life of freedom? It is difficult to be certain. We have so many questions about Margaret Pine. In addition, you can see some of the problems that arise when dealing with old news articles. This one seems to contradict itself and raises even more questions. Did Margaret Pine, not wanting to live in the country, go back to live in New York? Or did she refuse to be manumitted, as this article seems to imply? Or both? Did she remain under the care of the Van Zandt family? Or did she go on to live as a free and independent person in Manhattan? What did it mean for Margaret Pine to be buried in the Van Zandt family plot? What does this mean for us as Zion to understand Margaret Pine as part of our story? Christina?
So far, research has focused around enslavement, segregation, especially within the churches. But in this last part, we'd like to talk a bit more about churchyards and burials. While churches were segregated, the cemeteries were also. As Marguerite said, Margaret Pine is buried in Greenwood Cemetery. She's buried with the family of Charles Van Zandt, Wynand's son. Based on our research, that seems to have been an exception rather than the rule. It was customary for people of color to be excluded from white cemeteries at the time. Other segregated cemeteries at that time include the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground. You can see here between 1840 and 1898, 500 to 1,000 people, primarily African Americans, Native Americans, and victims of 4 major epidemics in 1840, 1844, 1857, and 1867 were buried on this site. It is interesting that African Americans and Native Americans were buried with people who were considered, diseased, contaminated. We'll put them with them. Lastly, there was also the Indian Cemetery of Little Neck, and this is where the Waters family is buried. Now we ask ourselves, did Zion participate in this custom of segregation? If so, how? So far, we have found evidence that at least one member of Zion was buried in a colored burial ground. In the Book of Burials in the church vault, we found a record of the burial of Juliet Waters. She was Matinecock. She died in 1894 at the age of 22. And the entry says, service was held in the house at Little Neck in the AME Church at Roslyn, after which interment took place in the colored burying ground. Reverend Proctor, colored, conducted the service at the church, myself giving an address, that being Reverend Chas Jeffrey, pastor here at Zion Church. noted that Salem AME is the oldest African-American church in Roslyn. So Juliet Waters' burial raises some important and difficult questions for us. It seems that she was considered a person of color at the time, but was still a member of Zion, and that the priests at that time traveled to her funeral to honor her. But why wasn't she buried at Zion? Was it because there was a de facto policy of racial segregation, or because her family simply wanted her buried elsewhere? Juliet Waters' burial also points to how complex these historical questions about race can be. We know that Juliet was a Matinecock Indian, but she was also not buried in the Matinecock burial ground on Northern Boulevard, but in a colored burial ground in Roslyn that appears to have been owned and maintained by the Salem AME Church. Can we learn more about the many identities of people at Zion and how they were understood in their time? Now coming forward to our time, about 20 years ago, Zion came together as a body and wrote a new inclusion, or if you might say mission statement. The core of the statement hangs in a plaque at the back of the church. And it's a call to us all to remind us that Zion is God's shining light on a hill in the Queens community since 1830, inviting all people to join in loving, joyful worship and ministry as we strive to be Christ's hands and heart in the world. This is what we continue to strive for as a congregation. Part of that commitment is being honest about our times in our own history that we have not lived up to that standard, when maybe some were excluded or when some members felt they had second-class status. We remember to live up to our mission statement. Pass it up to you, Father Carl.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Marguerite. I want to conclude the presentation portion here by just naming some of these big, broad questions that have come up in the presentation already and that we are aiming to keep in focus over the next year. How can we learn more about what happened to Charles, Elsie, Caesar, and Margaret Pine? How can we learn what kind of experiences that enslaved and manumitted people had in the greater New York area? Were there communities of free Black people here on Long Island where maybe the Pine family went for refuge when, again, as Marguerite said, manumission, freedom from slavery, was definitely something to celebrate, but it was not an easy road. We were starting from scratch. Where did people find shelter, community, help? We're also curious, were other people enslaved by Zion's founders? There's some documents that we've seen that suggest that the Van Zandt family may have enslaved additional people. We're trying to sort through that, what that means. Were some of the original trustees of Zion also slave owners at some time prior to the founding of Zion? Again, Zion was founded in 1830. Slavery was formally abolished in New York State in 1827 with some really frustrating caveats and exceptions. But did the money, did the assets that were contributed to make this church possible, were they built on enslaved labor? These are questions that are important for us to ask and answer as honestly as we can. What role did enslaved labor play in the broader economy, in the New York economy, even after New York abolished slavery in 1827? One fact that we've come across in the sort of broader research this year is that there was a significant contingent of people in New York City who, at the beginning of the Civil War, wanted for New York City to be part of the Confederacy because so much wealth, so much of the trade that happened on the New York Stock Exchange was tied up in the slave economy producing cotton and other raw materials with enslaved labor. And those merchants were afraid that their profits would dry up if slavery was indeed abolished. how did racism and racist segregation shape Episcopal churches in this region in the 19th and 20th centuries, and even shape Zion? One of the things that I'm wrestling with in figuring out even how to describe this story to myself is this temptation of, that was a former time, that's just how it was. People just owned slaves. Well, I think that's actually, that simplifies the story, because in 1827, during the time that Wynand Van Zandt and his wife Maria were enslaving these people, the abolitionist movement was well established, quite public, and he would have certainly been exposed to those ideas, which meant that he wasn't simply acting out of ignorance of other options. He was choosing to hold on to these human beings as his property. So how do we tell the story that acknowledges the historical context in which enslavement and a racist hierarchy was just the water that people swam in, while also acknowledging that there were real moral choices that were made, and as we say in the prayer of confession, things done and left undone. So how did that tension play itself out even here at Zion? Did Zion have any abolitionists? Was there a debate happening right here within these walls? Later on, was anybody at Zion active in the civil rights movement? Was that something that registered in parish life? And lastly, the big, broad question for us to process, and I invite us to start this just right here, right now. What does it mean for us today that our founder enslaved at least 4 human beings? So I'd love to sort of open it up here, and I'm going to pose these questions. We'll just start with the first one. And it can just, there's a lot of information that we've been invited to process, but sort of let's give each other permission to answer from the heart, from the gut here. What feelings come up for you learning that our founder, Wynand Van Zandt, enslaved people, and that part of the wealth that made Zion possible was taken from enslaved people? What are some of the feelings that you're able to name? Disappointment, anger.
Nauseous.
I'm sorry?
And nauseous.
Feeling nauseous. Lynn?
Very uncomfortable, not surprised, because we using people, free labor to enrich yourself. That's one of the human conditions, that.
Uncomfortable but not surprised. Other feelings?
I was surprised.
Surprised.
Yes. When I first started doing the research and I typed in Wynand Van Zandt's name, one of the first things that came up was that article about Margaret Klein. And then as I read more articles about Wynand, glorious founder, I learned that he owned enslaved people, more than just one. And I was surprised because the history that I was taught told me that there were no slaves in New York. The North was free of slavery. So I was surprised. The truth was quite the opposite. That slavery was widespread in New York and Long Island and New England and up and down the East Coast. So I was surprised.
Because I'm grateful to Van Zandt for founding this place, but I'm also ashamed and angry about this enslavement of people. So I'm really confused about holding those two, or many feelings of tension.
Feeling confused about how do we balance the gifts and the wounds, which are from the same person. I will name that I feel some fear around that confusion myself. And this sort of gets into this second question. You know, resigned.
Not a big surprise, you did, and the way you come from me, not that myself, it's just like, that's what it was.
Hmm.
I shouldn't be surprised that anybody could say, but who wouldn't want to say? And you could do it legally. So for me, it's just like, okay, here's another.
And Christina naming something really important, that the way that we respond to this story is maybe inflected by our own different identities. I, as a white person, may be responding to this in a way that's different from Christina, who's saying, I'm resigned to this. I've known this all along. Having a more realistic or pessimistic understanding of human nature that I, as a white person, maybe don't have to look at directly a lot of the time. Does anybody else feel a little bit of fear or trepidation about learning more about this, or what it means for us to keep digging into this? Does anyone want to say, like, that's enough, thank you very much?
It's important for us to learn more. You know, like we all want to learn where we came from, especially recently with the whole ancestry and everything, everybody's digging into that more. I mean, I'm from the West Indies, and in the West Indies in Trinidad, where I come from, we got a black people, they call us the rainbow country, because we have English, but we wanted English for a very long time, so we're basically English. And we had the French and the Dutch fighting. And so we have, like, when the Chinese came in, they were slave labor in Trinidad primarily. And some the Indians. So we have, like, a bunch of secrets. Most households, they all mixed. Like I have, like, my mom is Chinese completely. My grandfather is Chinese. So my mom is half Chinese. I think my grandmother on her side is from Venezuela, so it's Spanish. My father's black, German, and so we like all mixed up on that. I was called as a child, sukiyaki kid, mixed up, we mixed up everything. And a lot of families in Trinidad are like that. So it's kind of hard sometimes, but I think we have to dig into it a little bit. And it brings up a lot of things. It brings up the anger, it brings up selfishness of people, all kinds of feelings. I guess you have to be strong enough to order that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But if you don't, you have to stay away. We just like learn the basics. I mean, in Trinidad, we learn history. We learned about the slave trade. We had to trace it from. We didn't have that many slaves in the West Indies for a while. So we had to we learned it. And American history and Western history is two different things.
Hmm.
You learn something. And you're like, ooh, I didn't learn. So like, I have friends when I came to the US, and we have friends and we have to give presentations to different things at school. And I didn't know about all the slavery from the South, much different. And there was a little even jealousy with some Southern blacks and what they call the West Indian blacks. They were like, you guys never went through that. So you have no background with it. You feel like that. You don't feel like that. This day, basically, the West Indian speaking to someone of the South.
Yeah.
A lot different, even within the same color and the same background. Even you can hear some Jamaicans will say one thing and try to have it, something else, and they're like,
Right.
And they always did tell you that. I don't know, put me, you know, someone says, why do that? And you something, oh no. Oh no.
As we were saying, identity is such a complex, multi-layered thing. Yeah. So something that you're saying, Greta, I'm going to go off script here with the questions here, like sort of thinking about the inverse of some of the fear of how difficult it might be for some of us to digest the truth, as you put it so beautifully. But what might be the rewards? What's the promise? What might be, what could we be looking forward to on the far side of some of this work? And you can feel free to speak about that as personally as you like. Regan.
Yeah, I feel overwhelmed because this is just a tiny symbol. It, having been inside church for 7 years and having been in leadership, remember crises of diversity and inclusion, which encouraged me that this is a church that's focusing on those things and confronting them now. But also an overwhelming feeling of dismay that for 100 years or more since these first evidences of this type of exclusion and wrong, that kind of hypocrisy is continuing in many forms. Way more, it seems overwhelming to recall. I don't know how you address it, but Lindsay, the priest, there was, you remember Marguerite? No. We had a huge fight here, and it was bad. Years. He was in the church. And the role of different sexualities in the management. And I have a proud to say that modern Zion, with what we're doing now and Pentecost, and many of you do, really addressing these things, the human right. I remember the first time it was so stunned by it was winter picking. Zion and all the other Episcopal churches got together. From Queens, I believe, I can't remember exactly what it was. 90% of the people that were there were of color. I was in an extreme minority. And I felt very out of place because of my whiteness in a general gathering of the Episcopal Church in Queens. So I guess my point to folks is this overwhelming social issues, that we have a chance to.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Regan. And I think part of what you're saying resonates with sort of what I sense is the promise here, which is that, I want to be, I want to live my Christian faith in the pursuit of justice and equity, and to ask what it means to be a follower of Jesus in radically unequal and unjust times. And many of my friends who are not Christians sort of are mystified that I want to do that within the church. And that the church, that my faith is the driving force behind that, because they see the church as an engine of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, and transphobia. And they have so much ammunition. They're so right in many ways. And I want to be free of the feeling that maybe I'm a hypocrite for wanting to hold on to the church while sort of like brushing away all the harm that the church has been a part of, and say, no, I just want to be like a good Christian. Something about doing this work and how that has all played out right here where we live, where we call our home. I think it's a way for me to say, yes, all of that is very much a part of our history. And we are writing a new chapter that doesn't try to just like brush all that under the rug or leave it behind, but is aiming to sort of gather that together and say, well, knowing all of that, what are we called to do now? How are we called to repair the wounds of the past? And how are we called to celebrate and carry forward all the amazing things about this place and this church?
So that 100 years from now, a group like us might be sitting looking back and saying, wow, look what they did.
Right.
Or look what they were trying to do at that. The same way others might have 170 years ago.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I also just think like, I just get tired of spending a lot of energy like making excuses for the church, you know? And what if this work is a way of moving beyond like the excuses and putting that energy into the healing? You know, we know this truth, we're not afraid of it. We're not trying to get out of it. We've processed it, and now we're taking steps forward, and that's where our energy can go.
Well, you chose a great place to do it. Queens is the most diverse 25 square miles on Earth. Whether we're all living harmoniously together or not, we are the most diverse place on Earth. Oh,
And the Diocese of Long Island is the most diverse diocese in the Episcopal Church.
really?
I bet that a diocesan convention event in another place that you would not find yourself in the minority league. So let's conclude with sort of this this final question here. No, I want to talk about this third question. As Christina pointed us to our current mission statement, that Zion is inviting all people to joyful worship and ministry as we strive to be Christ's hands and heart in this world. Given our commitment to that today and going forward, how can we talk about this stuff in our history that does not reflect that at all? How can we talk about it, again, not trying to brush it under the rug, not trying to make excuses, but how do we say that is us, and it's not who we are trying to be? Does anybody have any sort of thoughts? Does that stir up anything for anybody?
We have to shine the light on the truth. The truth has to be told.
We have to shine the light on the truth.
And that's what Zion does, right?
Hmm.
Shining light on the hill, right? So we have to, be aware of our past. There are, as you said, we can't make excuses for it. We should not make excuses for it. We have to come to accept what it was. But then we have to work towards reconciliation. God's forgiveness and, the forgiveness among ourselves, I guess.
Other thoughts?
Forgive yourself, I think a lot of us, when we look in the past, things happened. It happened in all different, not just the Christian community, but other community. Whereas the Jewish community, just what's happening in Texas with them trying to shut, say that the Holocaust didn't happen, I think human beings, I think we are human, that we try with something that makes us a little uncomfortable like that. We try to be like, okay, that didn't really happen, or it didn't happen in that manner, but it did, it happened. We Asian blacks would say, well, I had this discussion with my son, he said, how is it that people from Africa would walk all the way across here? Why did they fight? Why do people walk into the things into the office, into the office? Because you're talking about people from Africa who fought lions. This is my son talking. Who fought lions and bears and stuff like that. Why did they let really white guys with some guns so they could only shoot one time? Drag them off on a boat and take them so people could live fight. And I say that's a lot of questions that's answered to us, but also you have to remember that their own chiefs gave them up. That's that there's a lot of questions that each human being has to answer. How we feel about it, But we have to come to the realization that it happened, and we can move forward and try to not let it happen again. I went to St. George's Church in Flushing in the 70s, and we were put down in the basement, blacks, to do Sunday school, to do Bible study. That was just what, 40-something years ago. I mean, when we were going to have Bible studies, so God, like, in the basement, it's cold down there, it's dirty. And they were like, oh, no, but you guys don't want to study.
I'm so
That
sorry.
was shameful. And there were some blacks in the church at the time, but they were okay with it. Because what we used to call them, that they go high color blacks.
What do you think?
High color blacks.
High colored
So,
blacks.
like being black, so they were white accepted. Like the church. And we had a priest that was there, that will allow that. It's a very hard thing to digest and to understand.
Especially happening as recently as.
That's just a little bit. That's the other things that I'm like, oh my God. But I find a lot of times that once we have passed certain things, we ourselves turn around and do the same type of thing. I never understood that. How someone who can be looked down on and all the things that happen, and then we turn around, once we pass that stage, we turn around and do to someone else. That happens. I mean, you see the whites did it to the black, and the black turn around to the Chinese, and the Chinese turn around to the Spanish. And it's like this stupid little thing that we own, that we can't get over.
I want to lift up something that you're saying, Greta, that resonates with something Christina said earlier, which is that maybe part of the invitation here is to kind of lower our understanding of human nature. That by virtue of being human beings, we're not just good people. We're much more complicated than that. We're people who are beloved by God, who do good things and who do things that we need to confess. And that as our identity, our positions shift, sometimes a person who is deeply committed to justice when they're on the bottom of the system uses their power to put somebody else on the bottom later on. And we're called to a higher awareness of that. But also, I think sort of something about, there's an invitation here to be rooted in a more kind of like confessional identity. Like, I'm not a good person. I'm a person who confesses my sins every day, and I always have something to say. So like sort of that humility, the humility of that. That could also be a real position of sort of strength and centeredness, I think. Because again, you're not having to, I feel like I don't have to defend my identity as good. And I don't have to put energy into that. When I make a mistake, when I hurt someone, I can just own it, put my energy into asking for forgiveness and making repair.
Yeah, I was thinking, Greg was talking of Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that the church is uniquely positioned to do this work because we're all starting at a place of none of us are without sin. If we mess up, we're beloved by God and we're sinners, like simultaneously. And
Yes.
so I think some institutions, when they confront this, they probably spend a lot of time on, am I still a good person, or am I a bad person, or how do I feel about this? And we can we have those questions too, but we can, Wyman Van Zant is a sinner, and so is Lindsay Lunn. Wyman Van Zant created a community that nourishes hundreds of thousands of people over the years, and I've done good things, like, we're complicated. But I think that as a church, this work is right in our wheelhouse versus like a university or any other sort of institution that has to do this work, because we're always wrestling with our missing the mark.
Yeah. Beautiful. Any concluding thoughts? Regan.
Wednesday in Bible school, we were talking about acknowledging, accepting. That's why I love the usher. A chance to acknowledge everybody as they walk in. I take great pleasure in that. To see and accept the truth of another person is very exciting. So I guess there's a little sign of acknowledgement where I also need to acknowledge, which is what we're here today, acknowledge that this happened. We're either not accepting or accepting, but we have to confront it and work through it.
Regan. How about we close with a word of prayer? The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we are sinners in your sight, and we are not worthy to come under your roof. And yet you set a table for us. You welcome home all your prodigal children with feasting and with joy. Guide us and help us in this work of acknowledgement. Guide us as we expand the story that we tell about ourselves. Help us to shine your light upon the truth. And help us to live in it as your hands and heart in this world. Help us to remember that wherever we come from, and whatever we have done and left undone, you always welcome us into your redeeming work. That there is a place for all of us in your dream for this world. There is nothing we can do to exile ourselves from your loving heart. So give us courage and endurance as we seek to follow you. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.